The steam from the iron always smelled slightly of scorched lavender, a scent I had associated with quiet, orderly Sundays for 40 years. But on this particular Sunday, the steam carried the sharp, heavy odor of damp clay and expensive detergent. I was standing in the small utility room just off the kitchen, pressing the collar of my daughter-in-law's cream silk blouse. It was a delicate fabric, the kind that required a damp cloth between the iron and the silks so it wouldn't scorch. Clara had left it on the banister that morning, draped carelessly over the wooden handrail with a short, printed note pinned to the sleeve. Needs to be ready by 5 p.m. Dry cleaner style, please. She hadn't asked. She rarely did anymore. When my husband, Arthur, passed away 4 years ago, the silence in this house had been large and heavy, like an unused room. I had built this home with him, brick by brick, mortgage payment by mortgage payment, over 35 years of quiet marriage. It was a handsome craftsman house, filled with dark oak wainscoting and leaded glass windows that caught the late afternoon sun. After the funeral, when my son Julian and his wife Clara suggested they move in temporarily to help me transition through my grief, I had felt a profound sense of relief. I pictured shared dinners, the laughter of my grandchildren running down the long hallway, and the warmth of a full house. I did not picture myself standing in the dark basement utility room at 3 in the afternoon, ironing clothes that didn't belong to me, while my own joints ached from the damp cold. A family doesn't usually realize they've turned a mother into a servant. They simply assume her love is a form of gravity, holding up their walls without ever needing to be thanked. Through the floorboards above, I heard the muffled, rhythmic thud of my grandchildren, Leo and Mia, playing in the living room. Then came the sound of the sliding glass door opening, followed by the low, resonant murmur of Julian's voice, accompanied by the sharper, faster cadences of his sister, Maeve. Maeve had dropped by for Sunday lunch, a lunch I had spent 4 hours preparing, a slow-roasted beef brisket, glazed carrots, and homemade sourdough bread. Now they were in the dining room, directly above my head. The heating vent in the utility room was old, its tin ductwork acting as a crude megaphone, carrying their voices straight down to where I stood with the iron in my hand. It's just about efficiency, Maeve. Clara was saying her voice had that bright, administrative tone she used when she was organizing her charity committees. The house is over 3,000 square feet. It's ridiculous for one person to occupy the master suite when Julian needs a proper home office and the kids are sharing a room. If we move her down to the guest room on the first floor, it's closer to the kitchen anyway. She'd have her own bathroom, and she wouldn't have to climb the stairs, Julian added. His voice sounded heavy, slightly muffled by what I assumed was a mouthful of my brisket. It makes practical sense. She's getting slower. Have you noticed how long it takes her to get dinner on the table now? Last night we didn't eat until 7. She's 64, Julian. She's not dead, Maeve replied, though there was no real defense in her tone, only the mild irritation of a sibling who felt she was being left out of a decision. But honestly, if you do shift her downstairs, we need to talk about the garage space. I need to store my winter tires and those patio sets somewhere. Right now, her old gardening tools are taking up the entire left bay. We can just pitch the gardening stuff, Clara said, her voice dropping into a casual, dismissive key. She hasn't planted anything new since Arthur died. The yard is mostly weeds anyway. We should hire a landscaping service to tear out those rose bushes and put in low-maintenance gravel. It'll save on the water bill. I stopped moving the iron. The hot metal rested on the damp pressing cloth, sending up a thin, hissing plume of steam that smelled of scorched cotton. My hand did not shake. At 64, my hands were the steadiest part of me, hardened by decades of kneading dough, pulling weeds, and scrubbing floors. But my chest felt suddenly hollow, as if someone had reached inside and cleanly removed my lungs. The rose bushes they wanted to tear out were the ones Arthur had planted for our 25th anniversary. They were Julie lynx, a deep, velvety red that bloomed late into October. We have to look at the numbers, Julian said, his forks scraping against the fine porcelain plate, a plate that had belonged to my mother, which I had spent 30 minutes hand-washing the night before, because Clara insisted it was too delicate for the dishwasher. The property taxes on this place are rising every year. If we're going to stay here long-term, we need to restructure how things are run. I checked the joint account this morning. The utility bills are astronomical. I don't know why she keeps the thermostat at 72. She says her hands get cold, Maeve said. Then she can wear gloves, Clara replied, and I could hear the dry, humorless chuckle that followed. We're the ones living in the real world, dealing with inflation. Honestly, Julian, if she's not going to contribute to the actual upkeep of the house beyond the cooking and cleaning, we need to look into transferring the deed. It's much safer for tax purposes if the house is in your name before she gets any older. If she ever needs long-term care, the state will just seize the asset. We'd lose everything, everything. They were talking about my home, the house that was registered solely in my name, fully paid off 5 years before Arthur died. The house where I paid the property taxes every April from my own modest annuity. The house where I paid the gas, the electricity, the water, and the high-speed internet that Julian used for his remote consulting job. They lived here rent-free under the guise of keeping me company, while I quietly absorbed the cost of their lives. I looked down at the iron. I lifted it slowly, setting it upright on its heel. The cream silk blouse lay on the board, perfectly smooth, free of wrinkles, pristine. It was a beautiful garment. It looked expensive. It looked like the kind of shirt worn by a woman who had never known the rough texture of a yellow sponge or the sting of bleach under her fingernails. I reached out and unplugged the iron. I didn't finish the left sleeve. I left a small, faint crease right near the cuff, barely noticeable to anyone who wasn't looking for it, but to Clara, it would feel like a personal insult. I stood in the dim light of the utility room, listening to the grandfather clock in the hallway upstairs strike 4. The house was solid. It was quiet, but the silence no longer felt like grief. It felt like an empty room, waiting for the furniture to be cleared out. They thought I was the foundation of this house, because I was always under their feet, holding them up without a sound. They had forgotten that foundations are made of stone, and stone does not feel pain. It only waits. I walked to the small corner desk where I kept my household ledger. I opened the drawer, pulled out the thick black leather binder containing the automated bill payments and sat down. The ledger was bound in textured black oilskin, its edges rubbed raw and gray by the friction of 20 years of accounting. Inside, written in my small, precise script, was the financial anatomy of our family. Arthur had been a man who believed in paper. He used to say that a screen could hide a lie in its pixels, but ink on paper had weight. It forced you to look at what you had spent. Every utility bill, every property tax assessment, every grocery receipt from the last 2 decades was categorized and logged. I turned the pages, watching the numbers climb. Before Julian and Clara moved in, my monthly expenses were modest. My water bill was $30, my gas bill $40. The internet was a basic package, just enough for me to read the news and video call my sister in Oregon. Now, the page for the current year looked like the balance sheet of a small, failing corporation. The water bill had quadrupled. Clara insisted on running 40-minute baths for the children every night, and the washing machine ran twice a day to keep up with their endless loads of designer activewear and linen sheets. The gas bill was nearly $300 a month because Julian refused to wear sweaters indoors, preferring to keep the thermostat at a steady 74 degrees. And then there was the shared credit card. 3 years ago, Clara had asked if she could link her grocery delivery app to my primary Visa card. "Just to make it easier, Eleanor," she had said, her voice dripping with that smooth, modern efficiency. "With the kids and my consulting work, I never have time to go to the store. We'll calculate our share at the end of every month and transfer it to you." For the first 2 months, she had transferred the money. By the 3rd month, the transfer was $50 short. By the 6th, she forgot entirely. And when I gently brought it up over breakfast, she had looked at me with wide, wounded eyes. "Oh, Eleanor, I thought we agreed that was our contribution toward the utilities. Since Julian is helping you manage the house maintenance now." Julian's maintenance consisted of calling a plumber I paid for whenever a pipe leaked, and occasionally parking his lawnmower in the driveway without actually cutting the grass. It is a strange feature of human greed that those who receive the most are often the first to believe they are being deprived. I looked at the total balance due on the Visa card for this month, $1,842. Most of it was Clara's organic grocery deliveries, gourmet cheeses, imported wines, and the premium streaming subscriptions she had added to my account because the kids need the educational channels. I sat in the quiet of the utility room and opened my laptop. My fingers, cool and steady, moved across the keyboard. I logged into my banking portal. First, I went to the credit card settings. I clicked on Authorized Users. I selected Clara's name, and with 2 clicks, I removed her. Then I changed the card number, reporting the old physical card as lost to prevent any pending automatic transactions from going through. Next, I went to the utility accounts: gas, electricity, water, trash collection, and the premium fiber optic internet Julian used for his daily video conferences. Every single one of them was set to auto-pay from my checking account. One by one, I toggled the switches from auto-pay to manual billing. I did not close the accounts. That would have been a loud, dramatic gesture, the kind of behavior they expected from an old emotional woman who had lost her temper. I wanted no drama. I simply withdrew my hand from the machinery. I stopped the oil that kept their gears turning. From now on, the bills would arrive as paper statements in the mail, addressed to the house. But they would sit in the copper tray by the front door, unpaid, until someone chose to notice them. At 5 o'clock sharp, I carried Clara's cream silk blouse upstairs. They were still in the dining room. The remnants of the brisket sat on the table, the gravy beginning to form a dull, greasy skin over the porcelain platter. Clara was typing on her phone, while Julian was showing Maeve something on his tablet. The children were on the sofa in the living room, the television blaring a loud, frenetic cartoon. "Clara," I said softly, stepping into the room. She didn't look up immediately. She finished her sentence, tapped the screen, and then raised her eyes. "Oh, great! Is it done?" "I need to pack it for my business trip tomorrow morning." "It's done," I said, laying the hanger over the back of an empty chair. I did the best I could with the sleeve. Clara reached out, her manicured fingers pinching the silk near the cuff. She frowned, her eyebrows knitting together, as she spotted the tiny, almost imperceptible crease I had left near the seam. "You missed a spot here, Eleanor," she said, her voice carrying a dry, clinical edge, "right by the cuff. It's going to look wrinkled under my blazer." "The fabric is very delicate," I said, keeping my voice level, polite, and entirely devoid of apology. "Perhaps it would be better to take it to the professional dry cleaners next time. They have the industrial presses." Julian looked up from his tablet, his brow furrowed. "Mom, don't be like that." "Clara's got a huge presentation tomorrow with the regional board. She just wanted it to look right. By the way, did you get a chance to look at the garden? The HOA sent another notice about the dandelions near the mailbox. We really need to get that sorted." "I'll keep that in mind," I said. I began to clear the table, stacking the heavy, greasy plates one by one. No one offered to help. Maeve merely shifted her water glass so I could reach the serving dish beneath it. "Oh, Julian," Clara said, her eyes still glued to her phone as she attempted to open her grocery app. "I'm trying to add some things to the cart for tomorrow's delivery, but it's giving me an authorization error. It says the payment method on file is invalid. Did you change the card?" Julian shook his head. "No. Isn't it linked to Mom's Visa?" Clara turned her gaze to me, her phone held between her fingers like a small silver mirror. "Eleanor, did you update your card recently? The app is rejecting the payment." I stood at the head of the table, holding the heavy platter of cold meat in my hands. The grease felt thick against my skin. I looked at her, then at my son, and finally at my daughter, who was waiting for the answer with mild, detached curiosity. "I did," I said, my voice as quiet and smooth as the silk of Clara's sleeve. "I had to make some adjustments to my accounts today. I'm sure you can put your own card on the app, Clara. It only takes a moment." The silence that followed was small, but it was the kind of silence that precedes a shift in the weather. The sudden drop in barometric pressure that tells you a storm is coming, even when the sky is still blue. For 40 years, my mornings had begun at 5:30. It was a habit formed when the children were small, and Arthur's shift at the postal depot started at 7. I liked the blue, quiet hour before the sun fully cleared the maple trees in the backyard. In those early hours, the house belonged only to me. I would brew a single pot of chicory coffee, sweep the kitchen tiles, and watch the mist rise off the grass. But on Monday morning, I did not get up at 5:30. I lay in my bed, watching the pale light trace the molding on my ceiling, listening to the house wake up without me. The transition was immediate, like a machine stripped of its gears. At 6:15, the heavy, impatient footsteps of my son began down the hallway. He went to the bathroom, then downstairs to the kitchen. Usually by the time his feet hit the first step, the smell of freshly brewed hazelnut coffee and toasted bread would already be drifting up the stairs. Today there was only the cold, stagnant air of an autumn morning. At 6:30, the floorboards above me creaked violently as Clara began her frantic packing. Her voice, thin and sharp with morning irritation, carried down the air shafts. "Julian, where is the black garment bag? And why is the kitchen freezing?" I got out of bed at 7. I dressed carefully in a gray wool cardigan and my favorite pleated skirt. I brushed my hair, pinning it back into its usual neat bun. When I descended the stairs, the kitchen was in a state of quiet chaos. The Sunday dinner plates, unwashed, greasy, and stacked precariously in the double sink, looked like a monument to neglect. The dried gravy on the brisket platter had turned a deep, varnished brown. Clara was standing by the island, her laptop open next to a half-empty box of stale cereal. Julian was standing in front of the coffee maker, staring at it as if it were an ancient artifact he didn't know how to operate. "Mom," Julian said, his voice carrying a mix of confusion and mild grievance, "the coffee maker is empty, and the sink is, did you not run the dishwasher last night?" "I didn't," I said. I walked past him, took a small copper kettle from the copper rack, and filled it with water from the tap. I was quite tired after preparing the roast yesterday. I decided to leave them for this morning. Julian blinked, his hand still resting on the cold glass carafe of the coffee machine. "Right. But Clara's got her flight at 9, and the kids need their lunches packed. Usually, you have the thermoses ready by now." "There is no turkey in the refrigerator, Julian," I said, placing the kettle on the stove and striking a match. The blue flame flared to life, casting a small warm glow on my face. "And the bread is gone." Clara looked up from her screen, her eyes sharp. "I tried to fix the grocery app last night, Eleanor. But when I put my own credit card in, it showed the previous balance of our pending cart, $480. It wouldn't let me check out until I cleared the unpaid balance from last month's orders. Did you cancel the payment?" "I removed my card from the account, Clara," I said. "The balance from last month was for the organic produce, the imported cheeses, and the wine you ordered for your book club. Since I don't eat those things, I assumed you would want to pay for them yourself. We teach people how to treat us by what we are willing to carry. The moment we lay the burden down, they do not praise our strength. They accuse us of betrayal." Clara's face went very tight, her jaw set, a small muscle twitching near her cheekbone. She closed her laptop with a sharp clack. "We've had an arrangement for 3 years, Eleanor. We help you with the house, and we share expenses. Suddenly changing things without warning is incredibly disruptive. I had to pay nearly $500 out of my personal account this morning just to get the grocery delivery scheduled for this afternoon. And now the kids have nothing for school. There are oats in the pantry, I suggested softly, pouring the boiling water over my tea leaves, and a jar of peanut butter. You could make them sandwiches. They don't eat peanut butter, Mom, Julian muttered, pulling out his phone. Clara, just DoorDash them some breakfast sandwiches from the cafe down the street. We don't have time for this. I have my weekly regional call with the Chicago office in 40 minutes, and I still haven't reviewed the slide deck. He walked over to the dining room table, pulling out his chair and flipping open his work laptop. I watched him settle into the space, his movements heavy with the entitlement of a man who believed the room existed solely to accommodate his stress. For 3 years, Julian had used the dining room as his personal office. His files, his high-end monitor, and his tangled cords occupied the mahogany table Arthur and I had bought for our wedding. I had been relegated to eating my meals on a small tray in the kitchen nook. I took my teacup and sat down at the small kitchen table, staring out the window at the dew-soaked grass. A moment later, a sharp, frustrated grunt came from the dining room. "What is going on with the Wi-Fi?" Julian called out, his voice rising in pitch. "It's taking forever to connect. The signal is there, but the bandwidth is practically zero. Clara, are you downloading something?" "No," Clara shouted from the hallway, where she was struggling to zip her suitcase. "I'm trying to book my Uber, and the app is spinning." Julian stood up, walking into the kitchen with his laptop cradled in one arm. "Mom, did you reset the router? My connection speed is barely 3 megabytes. I can't even open my email, let alone do a video call with 30 people." I took a slow, deliberate sip of my tea. The warmth of the porcelain felt comforting against my palm. "I didn't reset the router, Julian," I said, looking up at him. "But I did call the telecommunications company yesterday afternoon." Julian's face went pale. "Why would you do that?" The fiber optic gigabit elite package was costing $210 a month, I explained, my voice steady, almost conversational. "Since I only use the internet to check the weather and read my emails, I realized I was paying for speed I didn't need. I downgraded the subscription to the basic standard plan. It's $25 a month. It's perfect for my needs." Julian stared at me, his mouth opening slightly, his eyes wide with a sudden dawning terror as the clock on the kitchen wall ticked towards 7:30. Julian's face went through 3 distinct phases of emotion in the span of 5 seconds: disbelief, anger, and finally a cold, sharp panic. "Next Thursday?" His voice cracked slightly. "Mom, you can't be serious. I run my entire consulting business from this table. My regional call is in 20 minutes. I have 45 people waiting for me to present the Q3 restructuring plan. You've practically cut my throat. I'm sure you can use your phone's hotspot, Julian," I said, setting my teacup down with a quiet, solid click. "Or perhaps you can drive down to the cafe on the corner. They have excellent high-speed wireless, and the coffee is quite good." "A hotspot won't support a secure VPN and a video stream for 45 people, he snapped, his voice rising, shedding the polite, filial veneer he usually kept in place. "Why didn't you ask us before doing this?" We could have just paid the difference. But you haven't been paying the difference, Julian, I said, keeping my tone perfectly conversational. For 3 years, the utility bills have been paid from my checking account. I have the ledgers. You've never once offered to cover the cost of the fiber optic line, though you are the only one who uses it. Since I am adjusting my budget for the winter, I had to prune the luxuries I no longer require. Clara came marching into the kitchen, her roller suitcase bumping loudly against the doorframe. Her face was flushed under her makeup. Her cream silk blouse, with that tiny, stubborn crease near the left cuff, clinging to her shoulders. "Julian, my Uber is here," she said, her voice tight with a high-pitched, vibrating tension. But I just checked my account. The grocery delivery is delayed because they had to process the manual override for the unpaid balance. I won't be here to sign for it, and the kids need to be at school in 15 minutes. "Eleanor, can you drive them?" I looked at Clara. I looked at the dark circles under her eyes, the expensive leather of her designer tote bag, and the utter, unquestioning expectation in her posture. "I'm afraid I can't, Clara," I said. "I have an appointment of my own this morning. I'll be leaving in 5 minutes." Clara stared at me, her mouth slightly open. "An appointment? For what?" "It's Monday morning. You always take the kids on Monday mornings so I can make my early flights." We often mistake a mother's willingness to absorb chaos for her lack of a life outside of it. "I have a meeting downtown," I said simply. I did not elaborate. I did not offer an excuse. I stood up, walked to the hallway closet, and took out my charcoal wool coat. "Mom, this is incredibly petty," Julian said, following me into the hall, his laptop still clutched in his hand like a useless shield. "You're doing this because of what we said yesterday, aren't you? You heard us talking about the master bedroom." I stopped. I turned and looked at my son. I looked at the boy I had carried, the boy whose scraped knees I had bandaged, whose college tuition Arthur and I had paid by skipping vacations for a decade. He looked so much like his father, yet there was a hollow, calculating quality in his eyes that Arthur had never possessed. "I heard many things yesterday, Julian," I said softly, "but a house is a very large place. Sometimes, when it gets too noisy, it is difficult to hear what is truly important. I'm just trying to simplify things." I slipped my arms into my coat. From the living room, Leo and Mia walked into the hallway. They were half-dressed, their school uniforms wrinkled, their eyes wide and frightened by the unusual tension in the air. "Dad?" Leo asked, holding a single untoasted slice of bread. "Are we going to be late?" "Just get in the car," Julian muttered, rubbing his temples. He didn't look at them. He looked at Clara, who was already heading out the front door, her heels clicking angrily on the concrete porch. "We will talk about this tonight, Eleanor," Clara called back, not turning around. "This is completely unacceptable." I didn't answer. I waited until they had all scrambled out, Julian rushing the children toward his SUV, his face dark with fury, Clara slamming the door of her rideshare. The house fell suddenly, beautifully silent. The silence was different now. It was no longer the heavy, suffocating silence of neglect. It felt clean, like the air after a hard freeze. I walked out to my small sedan, the one Julian had suggested. They sell to pay for the children's private school tuition. I started the engine, backed out of the driveway, and drove downtown. My destination was a modest brick building on the corner of 4th and Elm. The brass plaque near the door read, Vance and Associates, LLC. Thomas Vance had been Arthur's attorney and subsequently mine for 30 years. He was a man of quiet habits and long memories. When I walked into his office, he was sitting behind a massive desk of polished walnut, a single manila folder resting in the center of the leather blotter. "Eleanor," Thomas said, rising to shake my hand. His grip was dry and firm. "It's been a while. You're looking well." "Thank you, Thomas," I said, sitting in the leather chair opposite him. I unbuttoned my coat, letting it drape over the back of the seat. "I appreciate you seeing me on such short notice. When you called yesterday and asked me to pull the trust documents, I admit I was a bit surprised," Thomas said, tapping the folder with his index finger. "Is everything all right at the house? Julian and his family are still living with you, aren't they?" "They are," I said, "but I suspect their tenancy is nearing its natural conclusion. I wanted to verify the legal structure of the estate before I make my next move." Thomas smiled, a dry, knowing curve of his lips. He opened the folder. "Arthur was a very prudent man, Eleanor," Thomas said, adjusting his reading glasses. "When we established the family trust 15 years ago, he wanted to ensure that no matter what happened to him or to the economy, you would never be vulnerable." "Do you remember the specific terms we drafted regarding the primary residence?" "I remember the general outline," I said. "But I want to hear the exact language, Thomas, especially regarding transfer of ownership and occupancy." Thomas turned a page, his finger tracing a line of dense legal prose. "According to Section 4 of the Arthur and Eleanor Vance Revocable Trust," Thomas read, his voice dropping into that steady, comforting legal cadence. "The property at 1422 Maple Lane is held solely for your benefit during your lifetime. It cannot be sold, transferred, or leveraged without your express written consent." He paused, looking up at me over the rim of his glasses. "And there is the rider," Arthur insisted on adding during our final revision. "If any adult relative, including children or grandchildren, resides in the property for a continuous period exceeding 12 months, they are legally classified as tenants at will. As trustee, you are obligated to charge them a fair market rental rate, to be deposited directly into the trust's maintenance fund. If no such rent is paid, and no formal lease is signed within 30 days of a written demand, the trust mandates their immediate eviction to protect the asset's valuation." Thomas leaned back in his chair, a quiet spark of admiration in his old eyes. "Julian and Clara have been there for 3 years, haven't they, Eleanor? And they haven't paid a single dime in formalized rent." "They haven't paid a dime, Thomas," I said, my voice steady in the quiet office. "In 3 years, they've never once offered to contribute to the property taxes, the structural insurance, or even the basic maintenance. They assumed that because I was their mother, the roof over their heads was a natural resource, like rain." Thomas nodded, his expression shifting from professional detachment to a quiet clinical gravity. He adjusted his reading glasses and looked down at the trust documents. "Legally, Eleanor, you have been in technical violation of your fiduciary duties as trustee by allowing them to reside there rent-free for so long," he said. "The trust is a separate legal entity. It was created to preserve Arthur's estate for your care, particularly your medical and retirement needs as you age. By letting them absorb the estate's resources without compensation, you are actively depleting the asset. I see, I said. The realization didn't frighten me. It felt like a heavy, solid key sliding into a lock. And if I choose to correct this violation now, then we issue a formal notice of rent assessment and lease requirement, Thomas said, his pen hovering over a yellow legal pad. We determine the fair market rental value for a 4-bedroom, 3-bathroom craftsman in your historic neighborhood. Let's look at the current listings. He tapped his keyboard, the soft click-clack of the keys, the only sound in the room. After a moment, he turned the screen toward me. In today's market, a home of your size and location easily commands $3,800 a month. And that doesn't include utilities, which we would legally require them to put in their own names. He looked at me, his eyes searching my face for any sign of hesitation, any flicker of motherly guilt that might cause me to retreat. If we serve this notice, Eleanor, they will have 30 days to sign a formalized lease at $3,800 a month, plus utilities, or they must legally vacate the premises. If they refuse both, the trust's mandate requires me, as the trust's co-executor, to file for their eviction. I will have no choice. The law does not recognize family sentiment when it comes to fiduciary neglect. Draft it, Thomas, I said. My voice did not falter. For 3 years, I had shrunk myself into the corners of my own home, trying to occupy as little space as possible so they could expand. I had felt guilty for breathing the air they wanted, for occupying the bedroom they coveted. But sitting in this quiet office, surrounded by the smell of old paper and leather, I realized a fundamental truth. Generosity is a quiet room. If you stay there too long, the people outside begin to think the door is unlocked because the house has no owner. I'll have the formal documents prepared by this afternoon, Eleanor, Thomas said, his tone softening slightly. I'll send them to you via registered courier. What you do with them is up to you. But once they are served, the clock begins to tick. Thank you, Thomas, I said. I left his office and walked out into the crisp autumn air. On my way back to the car, I stopped a small nursery on the corner. The benches outside were crowded with late-season plants. I bought a single small terracotta pot containing deep purple winter pansies. They were small, resilient things that could survive the frost. I wanted something living on my kitchen windowsill that belonged entirely to me. When I drove back down Maple Lane, I noticed Julian's SUV was already parked in the driveway. It was only 2 in the afternoon. I parked behind him, picked up my small pot of pansies and my handbag, and walked up the front steps. The moment I opened the front door, the heavy, suffocating tension of the morning rushed to meet me. The boxes from Clara's organic grocery delivery were piled on the porch, untouched. Inside, the house was cold, nearly 62 degrees. Julian was sitting at the dining room table, surrounded by his files, his laptop open. He was wearing his heavy winter coat indoors, his collar turned up against the draft. His face was pale, his eyes rimmed red, his hair messy, where he had repeatedly run his fingers through it in frustration. He didn't look up when I walked in, but his voice was tight, vibrating with an anger he had been nursing for hours. "Where have you been, Mom?" he asked, his tone flat. "I had to leave my meeting." The hotspot on my phone kept dropping the connection. I couldn't present the slides. The regional director had to take over, and he asked me, in front of the entire team, if I was having performance issues at home. I walked into the kitchen, placing my pot of pansies on the windowsill above the sink. The pile of unwashed Sunday dishes still sat there, the dried gravy dark and ugly in the afternoon light. "I told you I had an appointment, Julian," I said, my back to him as I adjusted the terracotta pot. "An appointment?" he mocked, standing up from the table. His chair scraped out loudly against the oak floorboards, a sound that used to make my stomach clench. He walked to the threshold of the kitchen, his arms crossed over his chest. "You had an appointment to buy a pot of flowers? While my career is taking a direct hit because you decided to play petty power games with the Wi-Fi." I turned around slowly, leaning my lower back against the counter. I looked at him, really looked at him. The entitlement was so thick, it was almost a physical presence in the room. He honestly believed I owed him my resources, my peace, and my home. "We're leaving, Mom," Julian said, his voice dropping into a cold, threatening register. He thought this was his ultimate card, the threat of abandonment. Clara and I talked on her way to the airport. "We're not going to stay here and be treated like unwanted guests in a house we've been keeping running. We're going to find an apartment. We'll pack up our things this weekend." He stepped closer, his jaw tight. "But you should think about what that means, Eleanor. Once we leave, you're on your own. Good luck paying the property taxes in this place. Good luck shoveling the driveway when the snow starts. When you're 80 years old and sitting in this drafty house by yourself, wondering why your children don't visit, remember today, you chose this." He looked at me, waiting for the tears, waiting for the apology, waiting for me to beg him to stay. He was so certain of his victory. I reached into my handbag, pulled out the thick white envelope Thomas Vance's courier had delivered to my car just before I left the office, and laid it quietly on the kitchen island between us. Julian's eyes drifted from my face to the thick white envelope resting on the granite countertop. The silence between us stretched, filled only by the soft, rhythmic hum of the refrigerator and the cold draft whistling through the dining room. He reached out slowly, his fingers hesitating for a fraction of a second before gripping the heavy paper. He tore the top flap open with a single, sharp motion. I watched his eyes scan the document. I knew the layout of that letter by heart. Thomas Vance had a very specific, old-fashioned style of formatting. The words "Notice of Rent Assessment" were printed in bold, black letters at the top, followed by a detailed breakdown of the trust's legal mandates. The fair market valuation of 1422 Maple Lane and the 30-day deadline. Julian's brow furrowed. He read the page once, then twice, his mouth opening slightly as the numbers registered. $3,800, he whispered. His voice was no longer angry. It sounded hollow, thin with a sudden dawning disbelief. He looked up at me, his eyes wide. "You're charging us rent? In my father's house." "It is not your father's house, Julian," I said. My oath was quiet, but carrying the weight of a stone. "Your father left this house to a trust, specifically designed to provide for my care. By living here rent-free, consuming the utilities, and expecting me to fund your daily lives, you have been depleting that trust. The law requires me to correct that. Julian let out a dry, harsh laugh. It was a defensive sound, a desperate attempt to reclaim the high ground he had so easily occupied just moments before. The law? Mom, this is ridiculous. We're your family. We moved in here to help you. You were rattling around this place like a ghost. Now you're handing us legal notices? What is Thomas Vance doing, filling your head with this garbage? Some people believe that family is a shield that protects them from the consequences of their own choices, forgetting that a shield only works if you don't use it to strike the person holding it. Thomas is simply doing his job, Julian, I said. He is protecting the asset. And as for helping me, I have folded your laundry, scrubbed your dishes, cooked your meals, and paid your bills for 3 years. If this is your definition of help, I would prefer to be helpless. He took a step back, the document trembling slightly in his hand. We don't have $3,800 a month to throw away on rent, Mom. Clara's consulting business is in a transition phase, and my restructuring at the firm, we're paying for private school for the kids. We have car leases. We have expenses. I know, I said. I've seen the credit card statements. I've paid for them. If you think we can just pull $3,800 out of thin air, you're living in a fantasy world, he hissed, his anger returning, hot and defensive now. We can't afford this. And we certainly can't find another place to live in this school district by the end of the month. You're putting us on the street. But Julian, I said, pointing a finger toward the dining room where his files lay scattered on my wedding table. Just 5 minutes ago, you told me you were leaving this weekend. You said you were packing your things and finding an apartment. Since you've already made those arrangements, this document shouldn't concern you at all. It simply formalizes your departure. He froze. The trap had snapped shut, and he knew it. His threat to leave had been a bluff, a cruel, calculated manipulation designed to make me feel small, vulnerable, and desperate for his company. He had assumed that the mere thought of being alone in this big house would make me bend to his will, that I would apologize for the internet, restore the credit card, and go back to being their quiet, invisible maid. He had never imagined that I would simply open the door and wave him through. He stared at me, his jaw working silently. Then, with a sudden, jerky movement, he pulled his phone from his coat pocket and tapped the screen. "Clara," he said the moment the call connected. He didn't use his earpiece. His hands were shaking too much. He pressed the speaker button, placing the phone on the counter next to the envelope. "We have a problem. A major problem. You need to listen to this. Julian, I'm just getting to my hotel." Clara's voice came through, tinny and distorted, but her sharp, demanding tone was instantly recognizable. "What's wrong? Did you get the Wi-Fi fixed? I need to review those files before my dinner meeting." "It's not the Wi-Fi, Clara," Julian said, his eyes locked on mine. "Mom just served us with an eviction notice, or a rent assessment, from the trust. She wants $3,800 a month, starting in 30 days, or we have to vacate." There was a long, heavy pause on the other end of the line. The sound of a siren faded in the background of Clara's Chicago hotel room. When she spoke again, her voice had lost its professional veneer. It was cold, sharp, and dripping with venom. "She's bluffing," Clara said. "She doesn't have the guts, Julian. She's an old woman who spends her days in the garden. What is she going to do? Hire movers to throw our things on the lawn? She's trying to punish us because we talked about the master bedroom. Don't sign anything. Don't agree to anything. She'll back down by Friday when she realizes she has to do her own grocery shopping." "She's not bluffing, Clara," Jules said, his voice cracking slightly as he looked at the signature of Thomas Vance at the bottom of the page. "It's a formal notice from the Trust's legal counsel. If we don't sign or leave, the Trust is legally mandated to file for eviction. It's not just her. It's the lawyers." "Then we cut her off," Clara snapped, her voice rising in pitch. "Julian, do you hear me? We cut her off completely. If she wants to play the legal card, she can live in that drafty museum by herself. Let's see how she likes it when she has no one to talk to. Put her on." Julian didn't hand me the phone. He just held it, looking at me with a desperate, ugly hope in his eyes. "You heard her, Mom," Julian said, his voice shaking. "If we leave, if we pack up and go, we are taking Leo and Mia with us. We will change our numbers. We will block your calls. You will never see your grandchildren again. You'll be entirely alone in this house. Is that really what you want? To die in this place with nobody who cares about you?" The words were meant to be a fatal blow. They were meant to pierce the very center of my motherhood, to play on the deepest, most primal fear of any aging woman. But as I looked at my son, I realized something that made the pain in my chest dissolve into a cool, clear certainty. I realized that even when they were in the room, I was already alone. Julian stood in the center of the kitchen, his phone still clutched in his hand, his breathing shallow and rapid. On the other end of the line, Clara's breathing was a tiny, static-filled hiss through the speaker. They were both waiting for the crack. They were waiting for the traditional, predictable breakdown of the mother. The tears, the trembling hands, the desperate bargaining of an old woman who would rather give up her house, her pride, and her savings than lose the right to hold her grandchildren's hands. I looked down at my hands. They were steady. I looked up at my son. I saw the desperate, ugly calculation in his eyes, the same look he used when he was a child trying to negotiate his way out of a punishment. But he was no longer a child. He was a grown man, using his own children as a weapon to strip his mother of her shelter. "You think you are threatening me with their absence, Julian," I said, my voice barely louder than a whisper. Yet it filled the cold kitchen. "But the truth is, you've already cut me out of their lives. They have lived under my roof for 3 years, and they do not know my middle name. They do not know what their grandfather looked like, because you told Clara it was morbid to keep his photographs in the living room." I took a slow step toward him. When I try to speak to Leo, he doesn't look up from his screen. When I cook Mia's favorite meals, Clara tells her my food is too heavy and makes her a separate salad. You've taught them to look through me, Julian. You've taught them that I am the woman who washes their sheets and irons their clothes, not their grandmother. If they leave, at least I won't have to watch them learn to despise me from across the dinner table. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. Through the phone, Clara's voice cut in, sharp and frantic. "Julian? Julian, hang up. She's having some kind of episode. Don't listen to her. We'll talk to Maeve. Maeve will get through to her." Julian didn't hang up. He stared at me, his face turning a dark mottled red. He realized with a sudden, terrifying clarity that the emotional leverage he had counted on for 3 years had evaporated. If the only way I am allowed to love my grandchildren is by paying for the privilege with my dignity, then the price is too high, I added softly. Before Julian could answer, the heavy front door clicked open. The sound of quick, aggressive footsteps echoed down the hallway. Maeve burst into the kitchen, her designer trench coat open, her keys jingling in her hand. Her face was flushed, her lipstick slightly smudged at the corner of her mouth. "Mom," Maeve said, not even looking at Julian as she marched straight to the kitchen island. "What is going on with the trust account?" "I just got a call from the BMW dealership. They said my monthly lease payment was declined. The automatic draft from your checking account bounced. They're threatening to repossess the car by Friday if it's not cleared." She stopped, finally noticing the thick white envelope in Julian's hand and the pale, frozen expression on his face. "What's going on?" Maeve asked, her voice dropping into a suspicious, defensive register. "Why is it so cold in here? And why are the grocery boxes still on the porch?" When you feed people from your own plate for too long, they begin to believe your hunger is a sign of their own superiority. Julian slowly lowered his phone, disconnecting Clara. He looked at his sister with a grim, hollow smile. "Mom's evicting us, Maeve," Julian said, his voice flat. "Or, rather, she's charging us $3,800 a month to stay here. And she cut off the high-speed internet. And apparently she's cut off your car payment, too." Maeve's eyes went wide. She turned to me, her jaw dropping. "Are you insane, Mom? $3,800. And my car? You promised Arthur you would take care of me. You know I can't afford that lease payment on my salary. I'm in sales. It's a bad quarter. I promised your father I would look after you, Maeve," I said, my voice calm, almost tired. "I did not promise to fund a luxury vehicle for a 34-year-old woman who hasn't bought her own groceries in 3 years. If you cannot afford the lease on your salary, perhaps you should drive a car that fits your budget." "You can't do this!" Maeve shouted, her voice echoing off the high ceiling. "Julian, do something!" She can't just change the rules. They can't pay $3,800 a month. They're flat broke. The words hung in the air like a sudden frost. Julian's head snapped toward his sister, his eyes blazing with a sudden, furious panic. "Maeve, shut up!" But the damage was done. Maeve, consumed by her own financial panic, didn't care about Julian's pride anymore. She waved her hand dismissively at him, her face tight with anger. "No, Julian. I'm not going to sit here and let her ruin my credit because of your stupid secrets. Mom, they didn't move in here to keep you company after Dad died. They lost their townhouse. The bank foreclosed on it because Julian put all their equity into a failed crypto fund, and Clara's consulting firm was sued for breach of contract. They were literally weeks away from being evicted themselves when they suggested moving in with you. I stood perfectly still. The pieces of the puzzle, scattered and confusing for 3 years, suddenly fell into place with a sickening, crystalline click. They hadn't rushed to my side to shield me from the cold, empty rooms of my grief. They hadn't sacrificed their independence to make sure their grieving mother didn't slide into depression. They had used my husband's death as a convenient, noble-sounding cover to hide their own financial ruin. They had turned my grief into their rent-free haven, using my loneliness as a shield against their own shame. I looked at Julian. He had looked away, his gaze fixed on the dried gravy in the sink, his shoulders slumped in a posture of utter defeat. "Is this true, Julian?" I asked. My voice was very quiet, very cold. He didn't answer. He didn't have to. The silence in the kitchen was the only confirmation I needed. The silence that followed Maeve's outburst was not the quiet of a peaceful room. It was the heavy, pressurized silence that exists inside a bell jar before the air is completely pumped out. Julian's face had gone from a mottled, angry red to a flat, pasty gray. He looked at his sister with a hatred so pure, so sharp. It seemed to physically push her back a step. Maeve, realizing the gravity of what she had just blurted out, closed her mouth tightly, her chest rising and falling beneath her open trench coat, but she did not apologize. In our family, apologies were seen as a form of surrender, and none of us had ever been taught how to yield. I stood by the kitchen windowsill, my fingers resting on the cool, rough terracotta pot of my winter pansies. I felt remarkably still. It was the kind of stillness that comes after a long, terrifying storm has finally made landfall. The waiting was over. The worst had already happened, and it had happened 3 years ago, without my knowledge. "A crypto fund, Julian?" I asked. My voice was very quiet, almost gentle. Julian didn't look at me. He kept his eyes fixed on the empty coffee maker. "It was a tech growth portfolio, Mom. It wasn't just crypto. The market took a downturn. Everyone lost money. And Clara's firm. It was a nuisance lawsuit. We were going to settle it. We just needed some breathing room. And you decided to buy that breathing room with my grief," I said. "That's not fair," Julian snapped, his head jerking up, his eyes wide and desperate. "We wanted to help you. You were alone. You were barely eating. We thought we could combine households, save on expenses, and keep you company. It was a win-win. We were going to tell you once we got back on our feet." "By letting me pay for your organic groceries?" I asked. "By letting me hand-wash Clara's silk blouses? By allowing your sister to draft her luxury car payments from my checking account? While she treated this house like a free storage unit and a laundromat?" The most painful part of discovering a lie is realizing that the person who told it believed you were too foolish to ever see the truth. They had looked at me and seen a relic. They had looked at my quietness, my routine of baking bread and tending to the roses, and they had assumed my mind was as soft as my hands. They had believed that because I didn't complain, I didn't calculate. "Mom, you're being incredibly cold," Maeve said, her voice rising in a whiny, petulant octave. "You have Dad's life insurance. You have the annuity. You have this massive house fully paid off. What are you even saving all that money for? You can't take it with you. We are your children. We're drowning, and you're standing there counting your pennies." "I am saving it, Maeve," I said, looking her directly in the eyes, "to pay for my own care when I am old. Because I know with absolute certainty now that if I ever became a burden to either of you, you would leave me in the cheapest municipal nursing home you could find and never look back. Maeve gasped, her hand flying to her collar. How can you say that? Because you are currently trying to financially starve me in my own home to fund your BMW, I said. And your brother is currently trying to figure out how to transfer the deed of this house to his name so he can leverage it to pay off his failed investments. Julian flinched. He looked at the white envelope in his hand, then at the phone on the counter, which had begun to buzz again. He didn't answer it, but a moment later, a sharp metallic chime echoed from his pocket. It was his personal phone. He pulled it out, his thumb dragging across the screen to dismiss a notification, but his hand froze. Because the high-speed internet had been downgraded to the basic, sluggish package, his phone was struggling to load the data. But the email preview was clear enough. No, Julian whispered, his face losing what little color it had left. What is it? Maeve asked, leaning over his shoulder. The school, Julian said, his voice trembling. St. Jude's. The automatic tuition payment for Leo and Mia. It failed. The registrar's office just sent an automated alert. Since the payment was rejected, they're suspending the kids' enrollment starting tomorrow morning unless we provide a valid card by 5 o'clock today. He looked up at me, his eyes filled with a sudden wild panic. Mom, the tuition, you canceled the visa. I did, I said, but that's their education. Julian cried, stepping toward me, his hands outstretched in an attitude of desperate pleading. You can't do this to the kids, Mom. They're 9 and 7. They love St. Jude's. You're punishing them for our mistakes. I am not punishing them, Julian, I said, my voice steady, entirely devoid of the anger he wanted to provoke. You are the one who chose to enroll your children in a private academy you could not afford, using a credit card that did not belong to you, while hiding the foreclosure of your home. If their education is your priority, you will find a way to pay for it. Or you will enroll them in the excellent public school 3 blocks from here. They can't go to public school, Julian shouted. The curriculum is completely different. Clara would never allow it. Then Clara should have thought of that before she spent $500 of my money on imported wine last month, I said. The kitchen clock struck 3. The shadows of the maple trees outside were beginning to lengthen, stretching across the cold, unwashed dining room table. Julian stood there, his phone buzzing in his palm, his sister staring at him in horror, and the white envelope of the rent assessment dangling from his fingers. The invisible structure that had held their luxurious, fragile lives together for 3 years had not just cracked. It had completely collapsed. And for the first time in 4 years, I felt like I could take a full, deep breath. Maeve's hands were shaking so violently that her car keys slipped from her fingers, clattering loudly against the hardwood floor. She didn't bother to pick them up. She stepped closer to me, her voice dropping into a desperate, pleading whisper that was far more offensive than her shouting. Mom, please, she said. Just this once. Just pay the lease for this month so my credit isn't ruined. I'll sell some of my bags. I'll find a roommate. I'll make it up to you, I swear. You can't let them take my car. How am I supposed to get to work? I looked down at the keys resting near her designer leather boots. You have a bus pass, Maeve, I said softly, and you have a pair of very expensive walking shoes. You will find a way, just as millions of other 34-year-old women do every single day. I am no longer your safety net. You're my mother, she cried, a tear finally spilling over her lashes, dragging a thin line of mascara down her cheek. And I have been a very good mother, I replied. But a mother's job is to raise her children to be resilient, independent adults. I have failed you in that regard because I made the ground beneath your feet too soft. It is time for you to learn how to stand on hard earth. Julian didn't join in her pleading. He had stepped back to the counter, his thumb rapidly scrolling through his phone, trying to find a way to transfer funds from his consulting business account. But I knew what he was finding. Thomas Vance had helped me review Julian's corporate registrations weeks ago. His business was a shell, burdened by tax liens and unpaid vendor invoices. There was nothing left to transfer. He tapped the speaker button on his phone again. Clara's voice cut through the room, no longer frantic, but cold, sharp, and calculated. She had clearly retreated to her hotel bathroom or a quiet corner of the lobby to speak without being overheard. Julian, Clara said, her voice dropping into a register of pure legal malice. Put me on speaker. I want Eleanor to hear this. You are on speaker, Clara, Julian said, his voice flat. Good, Clara snapped. Eleanor, listen to me very carefully. You think you've won some sort of petty victory here, but you're incredibly naive. You want to serve us with legal papers? Fine. But you should consult a real lawyer, not some 90-year-old relic like Thomas Vance. In this state, we have tenant rights. She paused, letting the words hang in the cold air of the kitchen like a threat. We have lived in this house for 3 years, Clara continued, her tone dripping with a quiet, ugly satisfaction. We receive our mail here. Our children are enrolled in school using this address. You cannot simply throw us out in 30 days. If we choose not to pay your ridiculous rent, and we choose not to leave, you have to file a formal eviction lawsuit. Do you know how long that takes? The housing courts in this county are backed up for at least 9 months, especially with school-aged children in the home. Judges do not grant quick evictions in the winter. Julian looked up, a slow, desperate courage returning to his eyes as he listened to his wife's words. He straightened his shoulders, his chest expanding beneath his heavy winter coat. She's right, Mom, Julian said, his voice gaining a sudden, ugly confidence. You can't force us out. We're not signing your lease, and we're not packing our boxes this weekend. If you want us gone, you'll have to take us to court. Let's see how the neighbors like watching the sheriff throw your grandchildren's beds onto the driveway next summer. Let's see how you enjoy living in this house with us for the next 9 months while we don't pay you a single cent. And you legally can't turn off the heat or change the locks. It is incredibly easy to maintain a reputation for virtue when someone else is quietly paying the price of your sins. They had spent 3 years treating me like a ghost, but now they were planning to use my physical presence as a hostage. They were going to turn my own home into a battleground of possession, exploiting the very laws designed to protect the vulnerable to shield their own greed. I looked at my son. I looked at the phone on the counter where Clara was waiting for my breakdown. waiting for me to realize I was trapped. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. "I expected you to say that, Clara," I said to the phone. And so did Thomas. I reached into my cardigan pocket and pulled out a second smaller envelope that had been tucked behind the rent assessment. I placed it gently on the counter next to Julian's phone. "What is that?" Julian asked, his voice faltering again, the bravado evaporating as quickly as it had appeared. "This is a copy of the utility management contract for the house," I said. "You are quite correct, Clara. Under state tenant law, a landlord cannot shut off the electricity, the gas, or the water during an active tenancy or an eviction dispute. It is considered a self-help eviction, and it is highly illegal." I smiled, a tiny, cold movement of my lips. "But as Thomas Vance pointed out to me this morning, those laws only apply to landlords who own the property personally. This house, however, is owned by the Arthur and Eleanor Vance Revocable Trust. And under the specific terms of the trust, if the trust's expenses exceed its income, which they currently do, because you are not paying rent, the trustee is legally forbidden from spending trust funds on non-essential services for non-beneficiaries." I tapped the paper with my index finger. "The gas, water, and electric accounts are not in my name, Julian. They are in the name of the trust. And because the trust is currently facing a deficit due to your occupancy, the utility companies have been notified that the trust is terminating its commercial contracts for this address effective Friday at noon. The trust is not turning off your utilities. The trust is simply ceasing to pay for them because it has a legal duty to preserve its remaining capital for my medical care." I looked at him, my eyes steady and cold. "If you wish to keep the lights on, Julian, and if you wish to keep the water running so your children can wash, you will have to put the utility accounts in your own names by Friday morning. But to do that, the utility companies will require a valid signed lease agreement, which, of course, you have just refused to sign." The line did not buzz. There was no dramatic, shouting defense from Clara on the other end of the speakerphone. Instead, there was a sharp, sudden click, followed by the flat, hollow dial tone of a disconnected line. Clara had hung up. She was a pragmatist above all else. She knew when a position had become entirely untenable. The moment she realized the utility loophole had been closed, she didn't waste her energy on useless anger. She disconnected to begin calculating her own survival, leaving Julian to stand in the cold kitchen and face the wreckage alone. Julian looked at the phone as if it had betrayed him. Maeve, meanwhile, was staring at the floor, her face pale, her lips parted in a silent, desperate panic. She slowly bent down, her fingers trembling as she picked up her car keys from the hardwood floor. She didn't look at me. She didn't look at Julian. She simply turned and walked down the long hallway, her heavy boots sounding like a march toward a scaffold. A moment later, the front door opened and then closed with a soft, final click. She was gone. She was going to figure out how to return a leased BMW she could no longer afford, leaving her brother to drown in the pool they had both helped fill. True silence is not the absence of sound. It is the presence of a choice that no longer needs to be explained. Julian slowly folded the utility management contract, his hands moving with an old man's stiffness that made my chest ache for a brief, fleeting second. He tucked the papers back into the white envelope. He didn't look at me. He couldn't. "You've really thought this through, haven't they?" he asked, his voice low, almost a whisper. "Thomas and I did, yes," I said. I turned back to the kitchen windowsill, picked up my small pot of winter pansies, and carried it out of the kitchen. I walked up the stairs, my knees aching slightly with each step, but my heart felt remarkably light. I went into the master bedroom. The room was large, filled with the heavy, dark, cherry wood furniture Arthur and I had saved for years to buy. It was a beautiful room, but it no longer felt like a prison. I pulled Arthur's old leather suitcase from the top of the closet. I opened it on the bed and began to pack. I packed my wool sweaters, my sturdy walking shoes, my sewing kit, and 3 of my favorite books. I packed carefully, folding each garment with the same neat precision I had used when ironing Clara's silk blouses. But this time, the labor was entirely for myself. It took me 20 minutes. When I was finished, I zipped the suitcase, picked up my handbag and the small pot of pansies, and walked back downstairs. Julian was still sitting at the dining room table, his head resting in his hands, his laptop screen casting a cold blue glow over his tired face. The kitchen sink was still full of Sunday's greasy dishes. The grocery boxes on the porch remained unopened. He looked up as I reached the bottom of the stairs, his eyes fixing on the leather suitcase in my hand. "Where are you going?" he asked, his voice raw, stripped of all the arrogance and anger of the morning. He sounded like a child who had been left behind in a supermarket. "I'm going to Oregon, Julian," I said. "I'm going to stay with my sister, Clara. Not your wife, Clara, of course, my sister, Clara. I've booked a flight for this evening. I will be gone for a month." "A month," Julian gasped, standing up so quickly, his chair scraped loudly against the floorboards. "But Mom, the utilities, the kids, St. Jude's. We don't have the money to pay the tuition by 5 o'clock. They won't let them into school tomorrow. What are we supposed to do?" "That is for you and Clara to decide, Julian," I said, walking toward the front door. "You are 38 years old, you are a husband, and you are a father. You have spent 3 years managing my life. I'm sure you can manage your own for the next 4 days before the power goes off." "Mom, please," he whispered, stepping into the hallway. His eyes were wide, wet with tears he could no longer hold back. "Don't do this. Don't leave us like this." "I am not leaving you, Julian," I said, my hand resting on the brass doorknob. "I am simply giving you the space you asked for. You told me you wanted to leave this weekend. Now you have the perfect opportunity to do so without my interference." I opened the door and stepped out onto the porch. The autumn air was crisp, carrying the scent of dry leaves and wood smoke. It felt clean. I walked down the steps to my mall sedan, placed my suitcase and the pot of pansies in the back seat, and got into the driver's seat. But before I started the engine, I paused. There was a small stack of mail resting in the copper tray next to the front door, which I had swept into my handbag on my way out. I pulled the envelopes out, sifting through them listlessly as the car's heater began to blow lukewarm air. Most of them were circulars and local flyers. But near the bottom of the stack was a thick, official-looking envelope from First National Bank and Trust. The bank where Arthur and I had kept our savings for 40 years. It was addressed to me, but in the upper corner, printed in small red letters, were the words, "Urgently confidential. Loss Prevention and Fraud Division." My fingers went cold. I tore the envelope open. Inside was a single 3-page document. It was a formal notification of a home equity line of credit. Application for $150,000 secured against the property at 1422 Maple Lane. I flipped to the 3rd page. There, in the space marked primary owner's signature, was my name, written in a shaky, clumsy imitation of my handwriting. And below it, in the space marked co-applicant, authorized representative, was the signature of my son, Julian Vance. The application had been submitted online 3 weeks ago, using an old email address of mine that Julian had set up for me years ago and still controlled. Julian hadn't just used my grief as a shelter. He hadn't just treated me like a maid and spent my money on groceries and car payments. He had tried to steal my home. The engine of my small sedan idled with a faint rhythmic vibration that felt remarkably like a heartbeat against the palms of my hands. The heater continued to blow lukewarm, slightly dry air onto my face, but I felt a bone-deep, radiating cold that no mechanical warmth could touch. I stared at the 3rd page of the document, my own name, written in that clumsy, desperate imitation of my cursive signature. I remembered teaching Julian how to write his name when he was 6 years old. I had sat with him at the kitchen table, guiding his small, sticky hand as he traced the letters Julian. I had told him then that a person's signature was their promise to the world, a mark of their honor that no one could ever take from them unless they chose to give it away. He had not taken my honor. He had simply tried to steal my survival. A home equity line of credit for $150,000. If the bank had approved it, Julian would have pocketed the cash and the trust, and subsequently my home would have been saddled with a massive debt I could never repay. When the payments defaulted, as they inevitably would have, the bank would have foreclosed on 1422 Maple Lane. He hadn't just been trying to move me into the guest room. He had been preparing to let the bank take the roof from over my head, all to cover the debts of his own reckless greed. We are often warned about the wolves at our gates, but the most dangerous predators are the ones we raise at our own table, who learn our names so they can call us by them while they take everything. I looked up, my gaze drifting to the rear-view mirror. Julian was still standing on the front porch. He looked small in his heavy winter coat, his shoulders hunched against the rising wind, his eyes fixed on my car. He was waiting. He was still hoping that the engine would cut out, that the brake lights would flare, and that his quiet, predictable mother would walk back up those wooden steps to save him once again. I put the car in reverse. I backed slowly out of the driveway, the tires crunching over the dry maple leaves. Julian's head turned, his eyes following me until I cleared the curb and turned the street, disappearing from his view. I did not drive toward the airport. Instead, I pulled into the empty parking lot of a small neighborhood park 3 blocks away. I took my phone from my handbag and called Thomas Vance. "Thomas," I said when he answered, "I have the mail. I have a letter from First National Bank's fraud division." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When Thomas spoke, His voice had lost all of its dry, professional humor. It was flat, heavy, and incredibly grave. "Did you authorize a HELOC, Eleanor?" he asked. "No," I said. "My signature was forged. Julian's name is listed as the co-applicant." "God damn it," Thomas whispered, a rare curse escaping his lips. "I was afraid of this." Julian called my office last week, asking about the title deeds, trying to find out if the house was held in a land trust or a standard revocable trust. I told him he had no authority to access those files, but I didn't realize he had already gone to the bank. What happens now, Thomas?" I asked, my voice remarkably steady. "First National's fraud division doesn't play games, Eleanor," Thomas said. "If they flagged the application, it means their internal algorithms caught the signature discrepancy. Or they noticed the application came from an IP address associated with Julian's failed business accounts. But here is the legal reality. If you do not immediately file a formal police report for forgery and bank fraud, the bank will assume you are complicit. They will freeze the trust's accounts to protect themselves, and they can proceed with a civil lien against the property for the investigation costs." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle in the quiet car. "To protect the trust, to protect your home, Eleanor, you must go to the precinct right now. You must sign an affidavit of forgery, and you must name Julian as the suspect. If you don't, you are legally shielding him at the expense of your own survival." The choice was clear, but it felt like a heavy, jagged stone pressing down on my chest. I was a mother. Every instinct of my biology, every year of my life spent protecting my children, shielding them from their own failures, screamed at me to tear the paper up, to drive back to the house, and to find a way to absorb the blow myself. But then I looked at the small pot of winter pansies sitting on the passenger seat. I looked at their deep, resilient purple petals. They didn't ask for permission to survive the frost. They simply did. "I'm going to the police station, Thomas," I said. "I'll meet you there," he replied. 40 minutes later, I was sitting in a sterile, brightly lit interview room at the county sheriff's department. The room smelled of cheap floor wax and old coffee. A young deputy with a tired, sympathetic face sat opposite me, a stack of formal forms between us. The pen in my hand felt incredibly heavy, as if it were made of lead. "I, Eleanor Vance, declare under penalty of perjury," my hand moved, writing the words in my small, precise script. I detailed the forgery. I wrote my son's full name in the space marked suspect information. As I signed the bottom of the affidavit, my real signature, clean, sharp, and authentic, I felt a strange cold click inside my mind. The final thread holding me to the boy I had raised had been cleanly severed, not by my anger, but by his own hand. I walked out of the police station at 4:30. The sun was dipping below the horizon, painting the autumn sky in shades of bruised purple and cold orange. Thomas Vance walked me to my car, his hand resting gently on my shoulder. "Go to Oregon, Eleanor," he said softly. "Get some rest. I will handle the detectives from here." "Thank you, Thomas," I said. I got into my car and started the engine. I turned onto the highway, heading toward the airport. The flight was at 7. I had plenty of time, but as I reached the highway merge, my phone began to ring on the dashboard. The caller ID displayed Julian's name. I tapped the screen to answer. "Mom?" Julian's voice burst through the car's speakers. He wasn't crying anymore. He sounded completely hysterical, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. "Mom, what did you do?" "Clara's accounts. Our joint business account was just locked. The bank said there's a fraud hold on the Maple Lane property. And, Mom, please, there is a sheriff's deputy standing in the driveway right now. He's knocking on the door. He's asking for me." "What did you do? Please tell me this is a mistake. Tell them you signed the papers." "I didn't sign those papers, Julian," I said. My voice was incredibly calm, a steady contrast to the frantic, ragged breathing vibrating through my car's speakers. "And I will not lie for you, not anymore." "Mom, please!" he screamed. I could hear the background noise now, the low, metallic squawk of a police radio through his open front door, and the faint, frightened crying of Mia in the living room. "They're going to arrest me. It's bank fraud. It's a federal offense. I have kids, Mom. Do you want your grandchildren to see their father in handcuffs? Please, just tell them you gave me permission. Just say you forgot." A mother's forgiveness is often treated like an infinite spring. But even the deepest well runs dry when those who drink from it begin to poison the water. "You should have thought of Leo and Mia before you wrote my name on those documents, Julian," I said softly. "You should have thought of them when you tried to leverage the roof over their heads to pay for your failed investments." "You're destroying my life," he sobbed, his voice cracking into a high, desperate register of pure terror. "You're my mother. You're supposed to protect me." "I am protecting you," I said. "I am protecting you from the illusion that you can steal from the people who love you and never have to pay the price. Goodbye, Julian." I reached out and tapped the red button on the dashboard. The screen went dark. The silence of the car returned, thick and absolute, broken only by the steady, quiet hum of the tires on the highway asphalt. I did not look back. I drove straight to the airport, parked my sedan in the long-term lot, and walked into the terminal carrying Arthur's old leather suitcase and my small pot of winter pansies. The flight to Portland was quiet. I sat by the window, watching the city lights shrink into a faint glowing web of gold before disappearing beneath a thick blanket of clouds. For the first time in 3 years, the knot in my stomach, the constant low-grade anxiety of waiting for the next demand, the next complaint, the next silent insult, began to slowly untie itself. When I landed in Portland, my sister Clara was waiting for me at the arrival gate. She was 70 now, her silver hair cut into a neat, sensible bob, her face lined with the comfortable, soft wrinkles of a woman who had lived a simple, peaceful life by the coast. She didn't ask me any questions. She didn't ask about Julian, or the house, or the trust. She simply reached out, wrapped her arms around me, and held me for a long, quiet moment. "Let's go home, Eleanor," she whispered. We drove to her cottage in Astoria, a small Los Angeles perched on a hill overlooking the gray, churning expanse of the Columbia River. The air there smelled of salt, damp cedar, and wet earth. It was cold, but it was a clean, honest cold. The next 5 days passed in a quiet, dreamlike rhythm. I woke up every morning at 6, but I didn't rush downstairs to make coffee for anyone else. I sat in Clara's kitchen, wrapped in a knitted blanket, sipping hot tea while we watched the fog roll over the river. In the afternoons, we worked in her small garden, clearing away the dead summer vines to make room for the winter planting. I set my small pot of purple pansies on her patio table, where they caught the pale, watery coastal sun. I didn't check my phone. I kept it turned off, resting in the bottom of my handbag in the guest room. I knew the storm was raging back on Maple Lane, but I had removed myself from its path. On Friday evening, as the rain began to patter softly against the cottage windows, I finally took my phone out and switched it on. There were dozens of missed calls and text messages, most of them from Julian, Clara, and Maeve. But there was also a single voicemail from Thomas Vance, left just an hour prior. I dialed his number. He answered on the second ring. "Eleanor," Thomas said, his voice carrying a deep, quiet gravity. "How is Oregon?" "It's beautiful, Thomas," I said, watching the rain trace long, silver paths down the window pane. "It's very quiet." "Has the utility contract been terminated?" "It was terminated today at noon, sharp," Thomas said. 5 hours ago, the power, gas, and water at 1422 Maple Lane have been shut off. The house is completely dark." He paused, and I heard the rustle of papers on his desk. "But that's not the only update, Eleanor. You need to know what happened on Monday night." "Did they arrest him, Thomas?" I asked, my voice steady. "They did," Thomas said. "Julian was booked on charges of grand larceny and identity theft. He spent the night in the county jail. He was released on Tuesday morning after a bail bondsman posted his bond. But because his personal and business accounts were frozen by the bank's fraud division, Clara couldn't pay the bondsman's fee. She had to use her own mother's credit card to secure his release." He let out a dry, heavy sigh. But the moment Julian got back to the house, Clara didn't wait around. She realized the tuition at St. Jude's wasn't going to be paid, and she knew the utilities were going off today. She didn't want to be stuck in a cold, dark house with the children. On Wednesday morning, while Julian was at his attorney's office, Clara rented a commercial moving truck. I held the phone closer to my ear, my chest tightening slightly. "What did she do, Thomas?" "She cleared the house, Eleanor," Thomas said, his voice dropping into a register of quiet disgust. "She didn't just pack her own clothes and the kids' toys. To secure her own apartment downtown and pay her divorce retainer, she stripped the dining room bare. She took the mahogany wedding table Arthur bought you. She took your mother's heirloom china. She took the living room rug, the television, and the silver tea set. She left Julian there, alone, in a stripped-down, powerless house, with nothing but his clothes and a sleeping bag on the floor." I stared out at the gray, rain-swept Astoria evening, listening to the soft, rhythmic patter of the water against the glass. Thomas's words hung in the air, cold and heavy. Clara had taken the mahogany table. She had taken my mother's heirloom china, the delicate white plates with the hand-painted gold rims that we only used on Thanksgiving and Christmas. She had stripped the dining room bare to pay a divorce lawyer, leaving my son to shiver on the floor of a dark, silent house. I felt a dull, familiar ache in my chest, but it was quickly replaced by a profound clinical clarity. Arthur and I had bought that mahogany table with our first joint tax return in 1978. We had carried it into the house ourselves, our hands raw from the cold, laughing as we tried to squeeze it through the narrow front door. For 35 years, That wood had absorbed the grease of our Sunday roasts, the spilled milk of our children, and the ink from the tax forms we filed every April. But Clara had not stolen my marriage, nor had she stolen my memories. She had simply stolen 60 pounds of polished cherry wood. It is a bitter mercy that the people who strip us bare of our memories often reveal that the memories were never in the wood or the porcelain, but in the strength it took to survive their loss. "Are you all right, Eleanor?" Thomas asked through the phone, his voice gentle. "I am," I said, my voice steady. "The table was just wood, Thomas. My mother's plates were just clay. They didn't make the family kind when they sat on them, and they won't make Clara happy now that she has taken them." "That's a very wise way to look at it," Thomas murmured. "But we have a practical problem. Julian is still in the house. The police released him on Tuesday, and he's been there ever since. He's refusing to leave. He's set up a propane camping heater in the living room, which is incredibly dangerous, and he's sleeping on the floor. He tells the neighbors he's protecting his property from intruders." "It isn't his property," I said. "No, it isn't. But with the power and water off, we are facing freezing temperatures next week. If the pipes freeze and burst, the structural damage to the craftsman woodwork will be catastrophic. As co-trustee, I have the legal authority to send a licensed plumber to winterize the house, meaning we drain the water lines and blow out the pipes so they can't freeze. But to do that, we need Julian out of the building. We can't have him tampering with the shut-off valves. He won't leave for a plumber, Thomas," I said. "He's desperate. He thinks if he stays in the house, he still has some leverage." "He doesn't," Thomas said. "But the situation has become more complicated. Have you spoken to Maeve?" "No. My phone has been off." "Well, you should know that the sibling dynamic has completely fractured," Thomas said, a dry, humorless note entering his voice. "Once the BMW dealership notified Maeve that they were repossessing the car, she realized she was facing a $10,000 early termination penalty that would ruin her credit. She couldn't pay it. So she went to the police." I frowned, shifting the phone to my other ear. "The police?" She filed a formal statement claiming that Julian forged her signature on the lease paperwork, Thomas explained. "She's claiming she had no idea the car payments were being illegally drafted from your trust account. She's trying to throw her brother entirely under the bus to shield herself from the financial and legal liability. She's telling the detectives that Julian was the sole mastermind behind all the financial irregularities in the family." I closed my eyes. I could picture them so clearly. 2 starving dogs locked in a cage, turning on each other the moment the hand that fed them was withdrawn. They had spent 3 years united in their quiet, polite contempt for me. But the moment the money stopped, their loyalty to each other evaporated like mist. "They are destroying themselves, Thomas," I said softly. "They are," Thomas agreed. "The detective called my office this afternoon to ask if the trust had any records of Maeve's involvement. I told them the truth, that the automatic drafts were set up using an online portal that Julian controlled, but that Maeve had been driving the vehicle for 3 years without ever asking how it was being paid for. The law doesn't care about convenient ignorance, Eleanor. They are both in a very dark place. We talked for a few more minutes about the plumbing arrangements, and then I hung up. I stood in the quiet kitchen of Clara's cottage, looking out at the Astoria harbor. The rain was falling harder now, obscuring the distant lights of the bridge. I picked up my handbag, took out my phone, and looked at the screen. There was a single unread text message that had arrived just 20 minutes ago, while I was on the line with Thomas. It was from Julian. I tapped the screen to open it. "Mom," the message read, the text stark and white against the dark background. "Maeve is lying. She knew about the car lease. She's telling the police I forced her to sign. Mom, they're going to indict me on federal fraud charges. If I go to prison, I'll lose the kids forever. Clara's mother has already filed an emergency custody petition. You have to tell the detectives that you knew about the Hellock. You have to tell them it was a family loan. If you don't, I'm going to end it. I can't stay in this dark house anymore. I have nothing left." I sat at Clara's kitchen table, the blue light of my phone screen illuminating the small, neat script of Julian's text message. "I'm going to end it. I have nothing left." For a fraction of a second, the old, familiar panic flared in my chest. It was the same panic that had driven me to stay awake until 3 a.m. when he was a teenager, waiting for the sound of his key in the lock. It was the same biological mechanism that had made me spend 40 years absorbing his failures, clearing his path and quietening his storms. A mother's nervous system is hardwired to respond to her child's distress with immediate, unquestioning surrender. But as I looked at the words on the screen, a cool, quiet voice in my mind spoke over the panic. Julian was desperate, yes, but he was also a master of emotional leverage. He had spent his entire life learning exactly where my boundaries lay, and he knew that the ultimate weapon, the threat of his own destruction, was the only card he had left to play. He wanted me to call the police and confess to a crime I didn't commit to save him from his own forgery. He wanted me to trade my freedom, my home, and my sanity for his convenience. Desperation does not alter a person's character. It merely strips away the polite fiction they use to hide it. I did not type a frantic reply. I did not call him, crying and begging him to hold on while I booked the first flight back. Instead, I dialed the non-emergency number for the county sheriff's department back in my hometown. "My name is Eleanor Vance," I told the dispatcher, my voice perfectly level, carrying the quiet authority of a retired school teacher. "I am currently out of state, but my adult son, Julian Vance, is residing at my property at 1422 Maple Lane. The utilities have been shut off, and he has just sent me a text message indicating he intends to harm himself. I would like to request a wellness check. We will dispatch a unit immediately, Mrs. Vance," the dispatcher said, her tone professional and calm. "Do you have a key to the property?" "No," I said. "But my attorney, Thomas Vance, is the co-trustee of the property and has a set. I will have him contact your officers." I hung up. I called Thomas next, explaining the situation in 3 brief sentences. "You did the right thing, Eleanor," Thomas said, his voice grave. "I will drive over there now and meet the deputies. If he is in crisis, the state has the legal authority to place him under a 72-hour psychiatric hold. It will get him out of the house, and it will get him the medical evaluation he clearly needs." "Thank you, Thomas," I said. I switched my phone off, placed it back in my handbag, and walked into the living room. Clara was sitting by the fire, her knitting needles clicking softly in the quiet room. She looked up as I entered, her eyes searching my face. "Is he all right?" she asked softly. "I don't know," I said, sitting in the armchair opposite her, letting the warmth of the hearth chase away the damp chill of the coastal evening. "But the police are on their way." "I have done everything a mother can do, Clara. I cannot save a man who is determined to burn down the house he stands in." Clara reached across the space between our chairs, her hands soft, warm, and lined with age, and squeezed my fingers. "You are a good mother, Eleanor. Sometimes the only way to love them is to let them hit the ground. I slept well that night." The rain on the cedar shingles of the cottage was a steady, comforting lullaby. The next morning, the sun broke through the coastal fog, casting long, pale beams of silver across the wooden floorboards. I turned my phone on at 9 o'clock. There was a single brief text from Thomas Vance. "The house is secured. Call me when you can." I went out to the patio, sitting in the pale morning sun next to my small pot of winter pansies, and dialed his number. "Thomas," I said, "what happened?" "The deputies arrived at 9:30 last night," Thomas said, his voice carrying the deep, physical exhaustion of a man who had spent the night in hospital waiting rooms. Julian was highly agitated. He had barricaded himself in the living room with that propane heater. He refused to open the door, shouting that we were trying to steal his inheritance. The deputies had to break the latch. He took a slow, heavy breath. "They took him to the county hospital under an emergency hold, Eleanor. He's safe. He's under medical supervision, and they are evaluating him. The doctors told me he's severely sleep-deprived and experiencing a significant situational crisis, but physically he is unharmed." I let out a long, quiet sigh. "And the house?" "The plumber and the locksmith arrived at midnight," Thomas said. "We've successfully winterized the property. The water lines have been drained, the pipes blown out, and the main valve is locked. The locks on every exterior door have been changed. The house is completely secured." He paused, and I heard the low crackling static of his car's Bluetooth system. "But Eleanor, you need to know what we found in the basement before we locked up. Julian didn't just sleep down there. In the days before his arrest, he went through Arthur's old workshop with a sledgehammer. He systematically destroyed everything. He smashed the workbenches Arthur built, broke his old hand tools, and tore down the cedar shelving." My throat tightened, a sudden sharp prick of grief behind my eyes. Arthur's workshop had been his sanctuary. He had spent 40 years in that basement, smelling of sawdust and oil, creating beautiful, simple things for our home. "Why would he do that?" I whispered. "He was looking for something, Eleanor," Thomas said softly. "He was looking for a safe or a cash reserve or the deed papers. In his panic, he thought Arthur had hidden money down there. But amidst the wreckage he made of the cedar paneling, he actually did find something. He just didn't realize what it was before the police took him." "What did he find, Thomas?" "Behind the tool closet, bolted directly into the concrete foundation, was a small, heavy steel lockbox," Thomas said. "Julian had tried to pry it open with a crowbar, but he couldn't crack the lock. He'd thrown it into the corner of the room. I brought it back to my office and used a master key from Arthur's estate files to open it. Thomas's voice dropped into a register of profound, quiet sorrow. Inside the box, Eleanor, was a single sealed envelope. It is addressed to Julian, written in Arthur's handwriting, and dated 5 years ago, just 2 months before Arthur passed away. I think you need to read it. The wind off the Columbia River carried the sharp, clean scent of the sea, rustling the leaves of the old oak trees surrounding Clara's patio. I sat in the wicker chair, the phone pressed to my ear, watching a lone container ship glide slowly through the gray, choppy waters. "Do you want me to read it to you, Eleanor?" Thomas asked, his voice gentle, carrying the quiet solemnity of a man who held a message from the dead. "Yes, Thomas," I said, my voice barely louder than the breeze. "Please read it." I heard the dry rustle of paper over the line, followed by the quiet clearing of Thomas's throat. When he began to read, he did not use his lawyer's tone. He read in the slow, measured cadence that Arthur had always used when he was reading the Sunday paper, aloud at the kitchen table. Julian, Arthur had written. "I am writing this in my workshop on a Tuesday evening in late September. Your mother is upstairs. I can hear her footsteps in the kitchen, moving between the stove and the sink. It is a sound I have lived with for 34 years, and it is the sweetest sound I know. I am writing this because I have watched you and Clara over these last few years. I have seen the way you look at this house, not as a place where your parents built a life, but as an asset to be partitioned, a ledger to be balanced. I have watched you treat your mother's kindness as your permanent birthright and her silence as a sign of weakness. You think I don't notice, Julian. You think because I am a quiet man. I do not see the calculation in your eyes when you ask about my pension, or the subtle contempt in Clara's voice when she asks your mother to clean up after your children. But a father notices everything. I have spent my entire life building a home to protect your mother. If you are reading this, it means I am gone. And it means you have done exactly what I hoped you would never do. It means you have broken into my workshop, tearing down these walls, looking for a safe or a cash reserve you believe you are entitled to. Stop looking, Julian. There is no money in these walls. The only true wealth in this house is the woman you are currently trying to discard. I have structured the family trust so that you can never touch it, never leverage it, and never force her out. If you have chosen to treat her like a servant in her own home, hoping to wear her down until she gives you what you want, you have made a catastrophic mistake. Your mother is a quiet matriarch, Julian. She is the foundation of this family, and she has carried you for 38 years. But she is made of stone, not glass. Eventually, she will stop saving you. And when she does, the fall will be entirely your own. I loved you, Julian, but I loved your mother first, and I loved her best. Remember that. Your father, Arthur. Thomas stopped reading. The silence that followed was thick, heavy, and deeply peaceful. I looked down at my hands. They were resting on my lap, still and steady. A single quiet tear escaped my eye, tracing a warm path down my cheek before landing on the gray wool of my cardigan. It was not a tear of grief. It was a tear of profound, overwhelming relief. Arthur had known. For 5 years, I had carried the heavy, silent burden of my children's neglect. believing I was entirely alone in my observation. But Arthur had seen the rot before he died. He had built the trust not just as a financial tool, but as a legal fortress designed to protect me from the greed of our own children. He had left the key in the lock, waiting for the day I was strong enough to turn it. A father's quietness is often mistaken for blindness, but those who build the walls of a house usually know exactly where the foundation is weak. "Are you there, Eleanor?" Thomas asked softly. "I am, Thomas," I said, wiping the tear from my cheek. "Thank you for reading that. Please keep the letter safe. If Julian's attorneys require evidence of his state of mind or his intent regarding the property, I think his father's words are quite clear." "I will," Thomas said. "But there was something else in the steel box, Eleanor. A secondary document. It is a copy of a legal waiver signed by Maeve 8 years ago." I frowned, my hand tightening slightly on the phone. "A waiver? For what?" "Do you remember when Arthur paid off Maeve's credit card debts back in 2018? Thomas asked. She owed nearly $40,000 to 3 different banks, and she was facing a civil lawsuit. Arthur agreed to clear the debt, but he was a meticulous man. He had me draft a formal binding agreement. I heard the rustle of a second page. According to this waiver, Maeve legally agreed that any further financial assistance she received from Arthur or subsequently from the trust during your lifetime would be classified as a direct dollar-for-dollar advance on her future inheritance. The trust's ledger was to be adjusted automatically. Thomas let out a dry, low chuckle. I've spent the morning auditing the trust's disbursements to Maeve over the last 5 years, Eleanor. Between the automatic drafts for her BMW lease, the cash transfers she requested for her rent loans, and the credit card bills she left on your desk, Maeve has siphoned exactly $98,450 from the trust. And what is her total projected share of the estate's liquid assets? I asked. Based on current valuations, her projected inheritance was $95,000. Thomas said, his tone dropping into a dry, clinical register. Maeve has legally disinherited herself through her own greed. She has siphoned her entire share of the family's assets, plus an additional $3,000 she technically owes back to the trust. If she ever files a claim for a portion of the estate after you pass, she will find she has already spent every single penny of it on leather seats and designer shoes. The realization was a quiet, devastating checkmate. Maeve had spent years using me as a personal bank, believing she was quietly siphoning her way to an easy future, entirely unaware that she was systematically erasing her own legal standing with every transaction. But Eleanor, Thomas's voice suddenly shifted, losing its professional satisfaction, replacing it with a cold, urgent tension. I received a notification from the county courthouse just 30 minutes ago. You need to be prepared for what Clara has done. I sat up straighter in my chair, my gaze sharpening as I looked out at the churning river. Clara, Julian's wife? Yes, Thomas said. She has filed an emergency petition for an ex parte injunction against you personally. She is claiming that your sudden, unannounced utility shutoff at Maple Lane was an act of deliberate endangerment and malicious harassment against your minor grandchildren. She is seeking an emergency court order to force you to restore the utilities immediately, and she is suing you for emotional distress. She is claiming endangerment, Thomas, I asked, my voice falling into a quiet, cold register. But she moved the children out 48 hours before the power was disconnected. Through the receiver, I heard Thomas let out a dry, rattling laugh. It was the sound of a seasoned chess player watching an opponent make a desperate, fatal move. Precisely, Eleanor, Thomas said. Clara is a very clever woman, but desperation makes people sloppy. She filed a sworn affidavit claiming she and the children were shivering in the dark on Friday night, huddled together without heat or water. She is trying to paint you as a malicious, unstable grandmother retaliating against innocent children. He paused, the sound of a pen tapping against a wooden desk carrying over the line. But I already have the signed rental contract for the moving truck, dated Wednesday morning. I have the security footage from the gate of her new apartment complex downtown, showing her moving her things in on Thursday afternoon. And I have a copy of her new lease, which she signed on Thursday at 2 p.m. The children were never in that house when it went dark. She is committing perjury, Eleanor, under oath in a court of law. Why would she take such a risk, Thomas? I asked. Because her new apartment down costs $4,000 a month, and her divorce lawyer required a $5,000 retainer, Thomas explained. She is flat broke. Her joint accounts with Julian are frozen, and she is panicking. She wanted a quick emergency court order to force the trust to pay her expenses under the guise of child support or emergency relief. She assumed you would be too terrified of a courtroom and too fragile to fight back. A manipulator will always use the innocence of children as a shield, but they forget that a shield of paper is easily pierced by the quiet truth. We are going to let her walk right into her own trap, I said softly. We are, Thomas agreed. The virtual emergency hearing is scheduled for Monday morning at 9 o'clock. I will represent the trust. You do not need to be present, Eleanor, but you are welcome to log into the video stream from Oregon if you want to watch the curtain fall. I will be there, Thomas, I said. The weekend in Astoria was quiet, but the air felt charged, like the quiet before a heavy frost. Clara and I walked along the wooden boardwalk of the harbor, watching the seagulls wheel and cry against a gray slate-colored sky. She held my hand, her grip warm and steady. Are you afraid, Eleanor? She asked as we watched the tide pull the river water out to sea. No, I said, breathing in the cold, salt-crusted air. For 40 years, I was afraid of what my family would do if I stopped holding them up. I was afraid of their anger, their disappointment, their judgment. But now that the foundation has crumbled, I see there was nothing to fear but my own willingness to be crushed. On Monday morning, I sat in Clara's small, quiet study. The window looked out over the misty pine trees, cascading down the hill toward the river. I opened my laptop and clicked the link Thomas had sent me. The virtual courtroom appeared on the screen. In one window sat Judge Margaret Evans, a woman with sharp, intelligent gray eyes, and a face that looked as though it had been carved from granite. In another window was Thomas Vance, sitting in his neat, wood-paneled office. And in the third window sat Clara. She was sitting next to her attorney, a young man with a slick, expensive haircut and a shiny gray suit. Clara looked pristine. She had styled her hair into a soft maternal bun, and she was wearing a simple dark blue knit sweater. She looked like the very picture of a grieving, protective mother who had been pushed to her absolute limit. She didn't look at the camera. She kept her eyes downcast, her shoulders slightly slumped. "Your Honor," Clara's attorney began, his voice booming through my laptop speakers, dripping with a practiced, dramatic outrage. "This is a matter of shocking, malicious cruelty. We are here today because an elderly woman, Mrs. Eleanor Vance, has chosen to weaponize her wealth to retaliate against her own daughter-in-law and her 2 minor grandchildren, ages 9 and 7. He waved a hand toward his screen, his tone rising in pitch. "My client's husband was arrested last Monday. It was a tragic private family crisis. But instead of offering support, Mrs. Eleanor Vance chose that exact moment to terminate the utility contracts on the family home. On Friday night, my client and her 2 small children were left in a freezing, dark house with no water, no heat, and no electricity. This is a clear case of intentional infliction of emotional distress and physical endangerment. We are seeking an emergency injunction to force the restoration of the utilities, and an order requiring the trust to cover my client's emergency housing costs." The judge listened, her face completely expressionless, her pen moving slowly across a notepad. When the attorney finished, she turned her gaze toward Thomas. "Mr. Vance," Judge Evans said, her voice dry and measured, "how does the trust respond to these allegations?" Thomas adjusted his reading glasses. He did not raise his voice. He did not sound angry or outraged. He sounded like a man who was simply reading the weather report. "Your Honor," Thomas said, clicking a button to share his screen with the court. "The trust's response is quite simple. We would like to present 3 pieces of evidence." He brought up the first document. "This is a certified copy of the moving truck rental agreement signed by the plaintiff, Clara Vance, on Wednesday morning at 9 o'clock. 48 hours before the utilities were scheduled to be disconnected. The next document is the lease agreement for her new luxury apartment downtown, signed by Clara Vance on Thursday afternoon at 2 o'clock. And finally, this is the security log from her new residence, showing her moving her belongings into the building on Thursday evening." Thomas looked up over the rim of his glasses, his eyes locked on the camera. "The children were never in the home when the utilities went dark, Your Honor. They were already residing in a heated, fully powered apartment downtown. The plaintiff's claim of physical endangerment is not only entirely false, it is a deliberate, fraudulent misrepresentation of the facts to this court under penalty of perjury." On the screen, Clara's lawyer froze. He slowly turned his head to look at Clara, his eyes wide with a sudden dawning horror. Clara's carefully practiced expression of maternal grief evaporated in an instant. Her face went incredibly pale, her mouth parting slightly as she stared at the documents on the screen. But Thomas was not finished. "Furthermore, Your Honor," Thomas continued, his voice dropping into a colder, heavier register, "we have filed a countersuit. When Clara Vance vacated the property on Thursday, she did not merely move her personal effects. She systematically stripped the home of assets registered solely to the Arthur and Eleanor Vance Revocable Trust including heirloom silver, antique cherrywood furniture, and valuable family china. Thomas leaned closer to his camera. "We are not here to discuss a tenant dispute, Your Honor. We are here because Clara Vance has committed perjury, and she is currently in possession of over $50,000 worth of stolen trust property." For several seconds, the only sound in Clara's quiet Astoria study was the low, steady hum of my laptop's cooling fan. The silence in the virtual courtroom was absolute. Judge Margaret Evans slowly lowered her pen. Her sharp gray eyes, cold and precise as flint, fixed onto the window containing my daughter-in-law, Clara. The silence was not the comfortable pause of a judge considering her words. It was the heavy, suffocating pressure of an impending storm. "Mrs. Vance," Judge Evans said, her voice dropping into a register that made even Clara's high-priced attorney visibly flinch. "You signed a sworn affidavit under penalty of perjury. You stood before this court and claimed that you and your minor children were subjected to physical endangerment and freezing temperatures because of the defendant's actions." She leaned forward, her face occupying the center of the screen, cold and unyielding. "Mr. Vance has just presented irrefutable evidence that you had already vacated the property and secured a luxury lease downtown 48 hours before the power was disconnected. You did not shiver in the dark, Mrs. Vance. You lied to this court in a desperate, fraudulent attempt to secure an emergency financial payout." Clara's lawyer cleared his throat, his face turning a dark, embarrassed red. "Your Honor, if I may." "Quiet, Mr. Davis," Judge Evans snapped, cutting him off with a single sharp wave of her hand. "Your client has committed a class felony in my courtroom. I am denying your emergency motion for an injunction with prejudice. Furthermore, I am giving your client exactly 48 hours to return every single item removed from 1422 Maple Lane to the physical custody of Mr. Thomas Vance. Every plate of china, every piece of furniture, every teaspoon." She leaned closer to her camera, her eyes boring into Clara's pale, trembling face. "If those trust assets are not returned, fully intact and undamaged, by Wednesday at noon, I will personally refer this matter to the state's Attorney General for grand larceny and perjury charges. Do you understand me, Mrs. Vance?" Clara did not answer. She couldn't. She sat frozen, her manicured fingers clutching the edge of her dark blue sweater, her eyes wide and glassy with a sudden, suffocating terror. Her attorney took a slow, deep breath, his professional composure completely shattered. "Your Honor, in light of these disclosures, my firm must respectfully request to withdraw as counsel for the plaintiff, effective immediately. We were not made aware of the timeline of the lease or the removal of the trust property." "Motion to withdraw is granted," Judge Evans said. "This court is adjourned." The screen went black. The virtual courtroom vanished, leaving only my own reflection staring back at me from the dark glass of the laptop. I sat in the quiet study for a long time, watching the silver mist drift through the dark green pine trees outside. I felt no joy. There was no sense of triumphant victory in watching my family fall apart. It was a sad, heavy kind of peace. I had spent decades carrying them on my back, believing that if I ever let them go, they would fall. Now, they had fallen, but they had done so because of the weight of their own greed. not because of my refusal to carry them. When you spend years bending the truth to fit your desires, you forget that the truth does not bend. It merely waits for you to stumble against its hard edges. I closed my laptop. Before I could stand up, my phone vibrated in my cardigan pocket. I pulled it out, expecting another frantic call from Julian or Clara's new attorney. But the screen displayed Maeve's name. I swiped the screen to answer. "Mom?" Maeve's voice came through, but it didn't carry the whiny, petulant anger of her last call. She sounded hysterical, her voice cracked and high with a frantic, desperate panic. "Mom, what did you do? I just got a formal letter from Thomas Vance's office. He sent me a copy of some waiver from 2018. He said my inheritance is gone. He said I've spent my entire portion of the estate on my car and my credit cards." "You did, Maeve," I said softly. "That's not fair," she screamed, her voice cracking. "Dad forced me to sign that. I was in trouble. I needed his help. You can't let him do this to me from the grave, Mom. You have the power to overturn the waiver. You're the trustee. You can't leave me with nothing. Your father didn't do this to you, Maeve," I said, my voice quiet, carrying the weight of a final truth. "He simply made sure you couldn't take my future to pay for your past. You spent $98,000 of my retirement money on leather seats, expensive vacations, and designer shoes. You signed that paper 8 years ago, knowing exactly what it meant. You simply assumed I would never have the strength to enforce it." "I'm your daughter," she sobbed. "And I am your mother," I said. "But I am no longer your bank. I hope you find a way to pay off the rest of your lease, Maeve. Goodbye." I disconnected the call. I turned the phone completely off, slipped it into my drawer, and walked downstairs to the kitchen. The rain had stopped, leaving the Astoria afternoon bathed in a quiet gray slate light. Clara was standing by the stove, brewing a fresh pot of chamomile tea. She looked at me, a soft, understanding smile on her face. "Is it over, Eleanor?" she asked. "The courts are finished, yes," I said, sitting at the wooden breakfast nook. "Clara has 48 hours to return the furniture. Maeve knows the truth about her inheritance. The house is locked and cold." Clara placed a warm mug of tea in front of me, her hand resting on my shoulder for a quiet, comforting second. "Then you can finally begin to heal." I took a slow sip of the tea, letting the warmth settle in my chest. But before I could answer, Clara's gaze drifted to the window overlooking the gravel driveway. Her hand tightened on my shoulder, her body tensing. "Eleanor," she whispered, her voice carrying a sudden, sharp note of caution. "There's someone at the gate." I stood up slowly. I walked to the kitchen window, parting the lace curtain with my fingers. Down at the bottom of the steep gravel driveway, standing in the cold, fading mist of the coastal evening, was my son, Julian. He was wearing his thin winter coat, his shoulders hunched against the wind, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He looked completely hollow, his face pale and thin, his eyes fixed on the warm yellow light shining from our kitchen window. He had tracked me to Oregon. He was standing there, shivering in the damp cold, waiting. I did not rush. I stood by the kitchen window for a long moment, watching the pale, wet mist swirl around the bottom of the gravel driveway. I reached for my gray wool cardigan, pulling it tightly around my shoulders, and buttoned it slowly, one wooden button at a time. My sister Clara watched me from the stove. her hands resting on the counter, her eyes filled with a quiet, maternal concern that required no words. "I'll go down," I said softly. "Do you want me to come with you, Eleanor?" she asked. "No," I replied, opening the back door. "I need to do this alone." The gravel crunched beneath my sturdy walking shoes as I descended the steep slope of the driveway. The air was cold, sharp with the scent of damp pine needles and the salty sting of the sea. The mist clung to my eyelashes, cold and clean. With every step I took away from the warm yellow light of the cottage, I felt the heavy, suffocating weight of the last 3 years slipping from my shoulders, dissolving into the wet coastal air. Julian was leaning against the wooden gate. He looked incredibly small. The arrogant administrative posture he had worn for years in my dining room had completely vanished. His thin winter coat was damp, dark patches of moisture soaking through the shoulders. His hands were shoved deep into his pockets, his chin tucked into his collar to keep from shivering. He looked so much like his father, yet he lacked the quiet, steady steel that had made Arthur a man. He looked up as I approached. His eyes were red-rimmed, hollow, and filled with a desperate, naked hope that made my throat tighten for a brief, fleeting second. "Mom," he whispered. His voice was cracked, raw from the cold and the tears he had spent the night crying. "The gate was locked. I didn't know. I didn't know if you were here." "I'm here, Julian," I said, stopping 3 feet away from the wooden barrier. I did not open the latch. "Clara's mother wouldn't let me in," he said, his words coming in short, rapid puffs of white steam. She blocked my number. "Clara, she's moving the kids to Chicago, Mom. She's taking them to her sister's." The bank froze everything. "The lawyers told me I'm facing indictment by the end of the month if the trust doesn't withdraw the forgery claim. I have nothing left. The house, it's so cold. There's no water, Mom. It's just empty rooms." He reached out, his cold, trembling fingers gripping the wet wood of the gate. "Please," he begged, a single tear cutting a clean, dark path through the damp salt on his cheek. "Just let me sleep on the couch, just for a few days, until the court hearing. I'll do anything, Mom. I'll clean Clara's house. I'll fix the garden. I'll help you with the bills. I can't be alone in the dark anymore. Please." We often think the hardest part of letting go is the act of walking away. But the true test of your healing is standing still when the person who broke you comes back, shivering, begging you to rebuild the walls of their prison. I looked at my son. I saw the infant I had held in the quiet hours of the night. I saw the boy whose scraped knees I had bandaged. I saw the man who had stood at my husband's funeral, looking at my home as if it were a prize to be won. I loved him. I would always love him with the deep biological ache of a mother who had carried him. But as I looked at his wet, pleading face, I realized that the greatest mercy I could offer him was the one he was most terrified of, the cold, unyielding truth. "No, Julian," I said softly. The words did not feel heavy. They felt as light and free as the mist rising off the river. "You cannot stay here, and I will not save you." Julian's face went completely still, his eyes widening in a sudden terrifying realization of the absolute boundary I had drawn. "Mom, please, I'm your son. You're supposed to protect me." "I have protected you for 38 years, Julian," I said. "I protected you from your failures, your laziness, and your greed. And in doing so, I made you weak. I allowed you to believe that you could treat me like a servant in my own home, forge my signature to steal my shelter, and never have to pay the price. I am no longer your shield. I reached into my cardigan pocket. I did not pull out a checkbook or a key. I pulled out a small folded piece of paper. On it, I had written the address of a local Astoria shelter and the contact information for a legal aid attorney Thomas Vance had recommended. I placed the paper on the flat top of the wet wooden gate. "There is a bus station 3 blocks down the hill, Julian," I said, my voice carrying the quiet, steady finality of a fading tide. "The bus leaves for downtown Portland at 6 o'clock. This is all the trust has to offer you." He looked down at the small piece of paper. His fingers trembled as he reached out, his cold skin brushing the wet wood as he slowly folded it into his palm. He looked up at me, his eyes searching my face for any sign of hesitation, any flicker of the mother who had always capitulated. He found nothing but stone. "Goodbye, Julian," I said softly. I turned around. I did not wait to watch him take the paper. I did not wait to see if he walked down the hill toward the bus station or stayed shivering at the gate. I walked back up the gravel driveway, my shoulders straight, my head held high against the rising wind. I did not look back. I walked back into my sister Clara's kitchen. The scent of hot chamomile tea and wood smoke welcomed me like a long-lost friend. Clara did not ask me what had happened. She simply closed the back door, locking it with a quiet, solid click, and handed me my warm ceramic mug. I sat down at the small wooden breakfast nook, looking out at the Columbia River. The sun had finally cleared the hills, casting a brilliant cold sheet of silver across the churning gray waters. On the patio table outside, my small pot of winter pansies stood stubborn and bright, their deep purple petals blooming proudly against the frost. For 40 years, I had believed I was the invisible foundation holding up the walls of my family's house, carrying their burdens so they wouldn't have to feel the weight of their own choices. But as the quiet light of the morning settled over the river, I realized the truth. I was never the foundation. I was simply the one who had chosen to step out of the ruins, leaving the cold, dark rooms behind to finally find my own quiet peace.